Middleware is one of the coolest ASP.NET Core features, and let's be honest, it's just cool and it always had some good PR. The main selling point of ASP.NET Core middleware is that they are just pieces of code that you can execute when the request comes in, but also when the response goes out. Unfortunately, theory and practice don't always overlap, and sometimes out of the blue you might get this exception. So in this video, I'll tell you everything you need to know about this exception, why we get it, and how to avoid it in the future. Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. Working with HTTP responses in ASP.NET Core middleware is not always that straightforward. And there are some common scenarios where we might actually want to do this, for instance when we want to manipulate in any kind HTTP response headers. But let me show you what I mean by that. Here we are in a blank ASP.NET Core minimal API, and let's get started by adding here a simple middleware. So we'll have here app.use, and in this use we'll have this async and context next, and that's the basic setup for a middleware. Now the only thing that we'll do here is await next, and we'll pass the context. So that's a regular ASP.NET Core middleware, and as the marketing is, here we would have code execute on request, and if we want to execute something after the request is executed, so basically on the response, when the response is on its way out, we would have to kind of like do here's execute on response. So here we are. Now, very common task when we work with APIs or minimal APIs in ASP.NET Core is that we need to manipulate headers, and more exactly response headers. And there are, from my point of view here, two different scenarios that we might face. The first scenario is when we might need to add some response headers that will be exactly the same no matter what the request. So for instance, let's say that we want to have a header here that would kind of like, well, add a hello world. So we would have something similar to this. And what we do here is we just add a header that has the key application and then hello world. Now let me execute this, and then let's move over to Postman to actually take a look. So the application is up and running. So let's head over to Postman, send a request. Here's the response. And if we take a look at the header, we see that this is our custom header application, and then the name of the application is hello world. And the name of the application will presumably be always the same. So that's the very first scenario that we might encounter when we need to manipulate headers. However, there is a second scenario which is very important, and that is when we dynamically need to manipulate headers based on things that happen in the response, or based on contextual information that we have in the response, like for instance the status code. And to keep things simple here, let's just imagine that we want basically to add a header to the response that contains the status code. So what we would be tempted to do here is move after this await.next and just add a header that we want. So what we do in this case, we just add a header. The key is called status code, and what we do here is we just get the status code from the HTTP response. And that's everything that we want to do here. However, if we run this application right now, and if we go over and make a request, we see that an exception has been thrown here. And if we take a look at the exception, it says non-handled exception occurred while executing a request, invalid operation exception, the response headers cannot be modified because the response has already started. Now let's try to understand this exception. When we think about HTTP, there is some very important stuff that we need to know. It's not complicated, but we need to be aware of it. So first off, in any HTTP response, we have two big components. We have the headers and we have the response body. The important thing to understand is that HTTP responses are usually streamed. And this means in turn that actually headers are sent to the client first as a response and the body is sent afterwards. And this means in turn that by the time we start to send the body, the headers were actually already sent to the client. And that's why we get this exception. But then you would ask, when does the response or the body start? And the answer to this question is not that straightforward, because well, it could start anywhere in the request pipeline. For instance, there might be filters that would already create a response, or the controller itself, or some other internal parts of ASP.NET Core that start already the response. So we don't know exactly which is the moment when the response or when the body starts. However, the situation or the context here is not that bad because ASP.NET Core, or the HTTP context better said, exposes us some very valuable information and ways to actually hook in our code when the response starts. Let's look into how this would look like. There are two important things that we need to be aware about when it comes to manipulating the response and adding headers. First of all, let's get rid of all this stuff. Now, the first thing that I wanted to show you is that on the context, basically what we have here on the response, and we have this has started. And this is actually a boolean, and this of course is false if the response has not started yet, so the body has not yet started to be written. And of course, this is something that we can use, for instance, to check if the response has started or not. And if we are not sure exactly when the response starts, that would be the method to actually get things done and understand when this response started. However, there is also another approach that we could use, and not to always check if the response has started, but instead ASP.NET Core offers us also an option, basically a method to just get hooked into our callback of ours in this onStarting. So on the context, on the response, we have this onStarting method that takes a func of object and of task. So we need to return a task. That's why we return task.completeTask here. And here in this code, we can perform any header manipulation that we want. And this method is actually invoked, or our callback is invoked, by the time when the response or the body is about to get started. So this is really the last place where we can hook into this type of procedure and add the headers that we want to our response. And in this case, we just want to add a header and once again the status code, and we get the status code from the response itself. Now, of course, obviously this method needs to be, or the callback needs to be registered before the await next. Otherwise, we would have the exact same problem. But now that we have wired everything up together and that we have used this onStarting method, we can run the application again and go over to Postman and create a new request. And this time we see that we don't have any exception, and instead we have here the status code of 200, which was successfully set as we did in that specific callback that we had previously to that context onStarting method. And that's mostly it on how we could kind of like safely manipulate or work with response headers, even if we need to define those headers dynamically based on some information that we already have in the response. So this onStarting method is really your best friend. So seems pretty cool and straightforward. However, there are some things that we need to be aware about. The first thing that we need to be aware about is that we should never use this onStarting method to actually perform changes to the body itself. The problem is that the body is trimmed as well, and any change, any tweak that we make there could potentially lead to some inconsistencies and unexpected behavior. And by the way, as per the documentation from ASP.NET Core, this onStarting method, or the purpose of this onStarting method, is to give us a way to manipulate headers, not the body itself. Another thing that is very important to understand is that obviously in each middleware you could use this onStarting to register some callbacks. And here the important thing is to note that all these callbacks will be executed in reverse order in which they were actually registered. So if you think about it, it's exactly like the middleware. So the first callbacks that are registered are actually the last to be executed when the response has started. It's really just like middleware. And I would call it a wrap. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and like this video so that you make it easier to discover for others that might also find this interesting. And if you're for the first time here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell so that you are always notified whenever something new happens on this channel. And if you think that this content might be valuable also for others, don't be shy and feel free to share it in your social media with your friends at work, wherever you think there might be people that would actually be interested in this content. Share it and I'm sure that they will be thankful to you. Last but not least, if you have any type of question or if you want to get in touch with me, don't be shy and head over to the comment section of this video and leave your comment, and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.